A very British heresy. Augustine's arguments about original sin were responsible, albeit unintentionally, for a new heresy that arrived in Rome in the last decades of the 4th century. And this is a proper, well-made heresy, because it's the first heresy from Britain. Oh, it makes you proud. Pelagius was a British monk who was working in Rome as a kind of spiritual director to a number of high-born Roman converts. In the time-honoured tradition of virtually any Briton on coming into contact with Johnny Foreigner, he was pretty unimpressed. These people weren't serious about Christianity. They had no real intent to change their lives. They weren't, in fact, making any attempt to try not to sin. One day, Pelagius heard a public reading of Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine was talking about his struggles with chastity. Augustine seemed to be saying that he couldn't possibly fight this sin in his own strength. He could do it only if God gave him the strength to do it. Augustine's concept of original inherited sin seems to imply that we can do nothing about sin ourselves. You could not overcome sin except through God's Spirit. It's all up to God. To Pelagius, it seemed that Augustine just wasn't making an effort. He argued that humans were not so fallen, so corrupt that they could do nothing towards their own salvation. Pelagianism, the doctrine that developed from his works, argued that Adam's sin was not an infection, but an example, a warning, just as Christ's goodness is an example to us all. We aren't born either damned or saved. We have free will. It's up to us. It was not that he didn't believe in grace. In the few pieces of his writing that have survived censorship and destruction, he made it clear that all good works are done only with the grace of God. But he did not see this grace as overpowering us, but enabling us. God wasn't pulling our strings like a puppet master. He was helping us along. In all men, free will exists equally by nature, he wrote, but in Christians alone it is assisted by grace. Pelagius gathered followers in Rome, but when the city fell in 410, his disciples scattered throughout the rapidly diminishing empire. One of them, Celestius, arrived in Augustine's backyard in North Africa. Celestius took Pelagianism to the extreme, arguing that since there was no original sin, there was no need for infant baptism. There was nothing, in fact, to forgive. Augustine led the fight against these ideas, and he recruited Jerome as well, who helped out in his own uniquely tactful way by calling Pelagius a hound of Albion, who is like a mountain of fat. Eventually, all the supporters of this extreme Pelagianism were dismissed from their posts. But the fight, as fights always do, pushed Augustine into ever more extreme positions. He almost certainly accused Pelagius of saying things Pelagius never actually said. Augustine declared that the sin of Adam had made it impossible for human beings not to sin. Non posse non peccare, in Latin. If you do good deeds, that's just because God has enabled you to do good, to be good. But then he argued that not only were all human impulses to do good a result of God's grace, but that God predetermines who should receive this grace in an entirely arbitrary way. God had chosen before time who would be foreordained to be saved through grace. It was in fact predestination, 1,000 years BC, before Calvin. The strength of opposition from bishops in Africa and from the Western Emperor Honorius forced Pope Zosimus to excommunicate both Celestius and Pelagius in 418. But they were long gone by then, living in the East, where their opinions caused much less bother. Unlike Augustine, Pelagius was fluent in both Greek and Latin. He was never condemned as a heretic in the East. Augustine, more than any other theologian, shaped the thinking of the Church in the West for the next 1,000 years. And he was a Western, Latin-speaking theologian. In some ways, you might say he got himself lost in translation. His theory of original sin, for example, was partly based on a faulty Latin translation of Romans. Theologians in the East didn't proclaim either original sin or predestination as part of the faith. God wishes all to be saved, said John Chrysostom, but forces no one. Anyway, there were more pressing problems for the Church in the West. By the time Augustine died in Hippo in 430, the Franks were rampaging in Gaul, the Lombards in North Italy, the Angles and the Jutes in Britain. Even Augustine was living in a city under siege. Hippo was being attacked by the Vandals, who were tired, presumably, of simply destroying bus stops throughout the empire. They would go on to capture all of North Africa and persecute the church, the city of God, that Augustine had done so much to define. Okay.